Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nishizawa banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 into a climbing turn, watching the distant speck of an American fighter lumber through the morning sky above Rabaul. The heavy, thick-winged machine moved like a flying anvil, slow, predictable, helpless. This moment of Japanese confidence would shatter within seconds, taking with it 3 years of aerial dominance and the lives of an entire squadron. September 15, 1943. The coral runway at Rabaul reeked of aviation gasoline, hot engine oil, and the salt-sweet decay of tropical vegetation rotting in the equatorial heat. Beneath the canvas-covered revetments, Japanese ground crews in sweat-stained coveralls wiped hydraulic fluid from their hands with rags that had seen too many sorties. The metallic ping of cooling radial engines mixed with the distant thunder of Allied bombing raids, a sound that had grown uncomfortably familiar in recent weeks. Nishizawa's Zero handled like silk in his experienced hands. The controls responded to the slightest pressure, the aircraft pivoting and dancing through the humid air with an agility that had made Japanese naval aviators the terror of the Pacific. His A6M carried the weight of tradition, 2 7.7mm machine guns, and a pair of 20mm cannons that had swept Allied fighters from the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. More importantly, it carried the pride of pilots who had dominated aerial combat since December 7, 1941. The American fighter above seemed laughably outmatched. Intelligence reports identified it as a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the heavy radial engine fighters that American factories were shipping to forward bases in increasing numbers. Japanese pilots had coined dismissive nicknames for these machines: flying barrels, American trucks with wings, symbols of a nation that valued brute force over finesse. What Nishizawa couldn't see from his climbing turn was the Thunderbolt's true nature. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns nestled in those thick wings, 4 per side, each fed from ammunition boxes containing 350 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. The massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 radial engine, supercharged and intercooled, generated over 2,000 horsepower. The pilot sat behind armor plating thick enough to stop rifle bullets, surrounded by self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb punishment and keep flying. More critically, the American pilot above understood something that Japanese tactics had yet to grasp. The era of the turning dogfight was ending. Captain Robert Johnson eased his P-47 into a shallow dive, building speed with the patience of a predator. His aircraft weighed nearly 8 tons, fully loaded almost twice the weight of the graceful Zero climbing toward him. But weight meant momentum, and momentum meant devastating energy in the hands of a pilot who knew how to use it. The Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger allowed it to maintain power at altitudes where the Zero's lightweight construction became a liability rather than an advantage. Johnson had studied the intelligence reports. Japanese fighters excelled in slow-speed turning contests, their buttery controls, and gyroscopic agility, allowing experienced pilots to outmaneuver heavier opponents in traditional dogfights. But those same lightweight frames that provided such agility came at a cost. No armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no ability to absorb battle damage and continue fighting. The mathematics of modern aerial combat were changing, and the Japanese hadn't realized it yet. As Nishizawa pulled his Zero through another climbing turn, confident in his ability to force the American into a turning fight where Japanese superiority would assert itself, Johnson's Thunderbolt reached 350 miles per hour in its dive. The massive fighter's controls grew heavy in the thickening air, but its structural strength allowed maneuvers that would tear apart lighter aircraft. What happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Johnson opened fire at 200 yards, his 8 machine guns creating a cone of destruction that no lightweight fighter could survive. The concentrated burst, 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, struck Nishizawa's Zero in the engine cowling and right-wing root. The Japanese fighter simply disintegrated. The Zero's unprotected fuel tanks ignited instantly, turning the graceful fighter into a falling comet of flame and twisted metal. Nishizawa, one of Japan's most experienced aces with over 80 confirmed victories, died before he could process what had happened. His aircraft, designed for agility at the expense of survivability, had been destroyed by a single brief encounter with American firepower. Johnson pulled his Thunderbolt up and away, the massive fighter climbing effortlessly on the power of its supercharged engine. Behind him, burning wreckage scattered across the jungle canopy, the first clear demonstration that the rules of aerial combat had fundamentally changed. But this was only the beginning. Across the Pacific, in hangars and ready rooms from Australia to the Aleutians, more Thunderbolts were being prepared for combat. Each one carried the same devastating armament, the same structural strength, the same ability to turn Japanese fighters into falling debris with a few seconds of concentrated fire. The war was about to shift in ways that Japanese pilots, trained in the traditions of individual combat and aircraft agility, could never have anticipated. Thunder was coming to the Pacific. Before we dive deeper into this transformation, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into aviation history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the machines and pilots that changed the course of history. The question that haunted Japanese air commanders in the autumn of 1943 wasn't whether American fighters were improving. It was whether their own advantages were disappearing faster than anyone wanted to admit. The maintenance log at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, recorded the damage in clinical terms. P-47, D serial number 4274968, returned with 17 bullet holes, shattered canopy, and hydraulic failure. What the log couldn't capture was the revolution in aerial tactics that bullet-riddled Thunderbolt represented. The survival of that aircraft would reshape how both sides fought in the skies over the Pacific. October 28, 1943. The flight line at Henderson Field hummed with the constant vibration of air compressors and the metallic clang of cowling panels being removed from damaged fighters. The air carried the sharp bite of hydraulic fluid, mixed with the sweet stench of high-octane aviation gasoline, and the acrid smoke from burning oil drums used to dispose of shot-up fabric and canvas. Ground crews in sweat-stained coveralls worked under canvas tarps, stretched between coconut palms, their hands black with grease as they patched bullet holes and replaced shattered plexiglass. Captain Francis Gabreski climbed down from his P-47, his flight suit soaked with sweat and stained with hydraulic fluid that had sprayed through his shot-up cockpit during the morning's engagement. 17 Japanese bullets had found their mark, yet his Thunderbolt had brought him home. Any other fighter, certainly any Japanese fighter, would have been a funeral pyre scattered across the Solomon Islands jungle. The mathematics of survival were becoming clear to American pilots, even if they didn't yet understand the full implications. 3 weeks earlier, Gabreski had watched a squadron of Marine Corsairs attempt to dogfight a formation of Zeros in the traditional manner, turning, twisting, trying to outmaneuver the graceful Japanese fighters at low altitude. The Marines lost 4 aircraft to Japanese guns before the survivors could disengage. The Zeros, untouchable in their element, had demonstrated once again why conventional fighter tactics played to their strengths. But Gabreski had been studying intelligence reports from the European theater, where P-47 pilots had learned to exploit their aircraft's unique characteristics against German fighters. The lessons were transferable, even revolutionary. Altitude was energy, energy was speed, and speed properly applied could overcome any amount of agility. The breakthrough came during a chance encounter over Bougainville, flying at 25,000 feet, an altitude where his Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger gave him a decisive power advantage. Gabreski spotted a formation of 6 Zeros climbing toward a group of American bombers. The Japanese fighters were still 5,000 feet below, struggling in the thin air that robbed their lightweight engines of power. Instead of diving immediately into combat, Gabreski did something that violated every instinct trained into traditional fighter pilots. He waited. The Zeros continued their climb. Their pilots focused on the bomber formation above. At 15,000 feet, they were still climbing steadily, their controls responsive, their pilots confident in their aircraft's legendary maneuverability. What they couldn't see was the single P-47, positioned like a hawk above them, building speed in a shallow dive that would deliver devastating momentum. At 370 miles per hour, faster than most Zeros could achieve in level flight, Gabreski's Thunderbolt swept down on the Japanese formation. His 8 machine guns fired for exactly 1.5 seconds. The concentrated burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the lead Zero in the engine and cockpit area. The Japanese fighter exploded, not caught fire, not spun out of control, not fell smoking toward the ocean. It simply disintegrated under the impact of 50 caliber bullets traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The remaining Zeros scattered, their formation destroyed, their attack on the bombers broken before it could begin. Gabreski pulled his Thunderbolt up and away, climbing back to altitude on the power of his supercharged engine. Behind him, burning wreckage fell toward the jungle canopy, the first clear demonstration of what American pilots would soon call boom and zoom tactics. But the Japanese were learning too, and their lessons were painted in the blood of their most experienced pilots. Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto read the after-action report with growing alarm. In the past month, his squadron had lost 11 aircraft to American fighters, not in the extended turning dogfights that had characterized aerial combat earlier in the war, but in brief, violent encounters that lasted seconds. The Americans no longer engaged in traditional fighter combat. They struck like lightning, destroyed their targets, and disappeared before Japanese pilots could respond. The enemy fighters attacked from above with great speed, Iwamoto wrote in his diary that night. They do not turn to fight. They strike and climb away, using their heavy engines to escape before we can respond. Our advantage in close combat means nothing if they refuse to fight closely. The implications terrified Japanese tactical planners. For 2 years, their fighters had dominated Pacific skies through superior pilot training and aircraft designed for individual combat. But the Americans were systematically negating those advantages through tactics that exploited technological superiority rather than pilot skill. Intelligence reports from captured American pilots revealed the systematic nature of the tactical revolution. American fighter squadrons were being trained specifically to avoid turning dogfights. Pilots learned to attack from altitude, fire devastating bursts from their heavy armament, then use their aircraft's power and structural strength to escape before Japanese fighters could respond. More disturbing were reports of American aircraft surviving damage that would destroy any Japanese fighter. A Marine pilot shot down near Munda had told his interrogators about Corsairs and Thunderbolts, returning to base with shot-off wingtips, destroyed tail surfaces, and engines riddled with cannon fire. American fighters could absorb punishment and keep fighting in ways that Japanese aircraft, designed for weight savings rather than survivability, simply could not match. The war was becoming industrial rather than artistic. November 4, 1943. The Ready Room at Munda Point buzzed with conversation as pilots studied recognition charts and target photographs. The smell of coffee mixed with cigarette smoke and the petroleum stench of fresh paint on newly constructed Quonset huts. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines warming up created a constant mechanical thunder that shook the coral dust from overhead beams. Major Robert Johnson briefed his squadron on their morning mission: escort duty for bombers attacking Japanese airfields at Bougainville. But the real purpose, understood by every pilot in the room, was to demonstrate American fighter superiority through systematic destruction of Japanese aircraft. The briefing emphasized tactics that would have been heretical 2 years earlier. No extended dogfights, no attempts to outmaneuver Japanese fighters in turning contests. Attack from altitude, fire short, devastating bursts, then climb away to attack again. Use the Thunderbolt's strengths, firepower, structural integrity, and high-altitude performance while avoiding its weaknesses in low-speed maneuverability. Gentlemen, Johnson concluded, we're not dogfighters anymore. We're aerial snipers. The mission proceeded exactly as planned. Approaching the Japanese airfield at 15,000 feet, Johnson's squadron spotted a formation of Zeros taking off to intercept the bombers. Instead of diving immediately into combat, the American pilots climbed to 20,000 feet, positioning themselves for coordinated attacks. The Zeros, climbing desperately to reach the American bombers, never saw the Thunderbolts diving on them from above. In less than 30 seconds, 4 Japanese fighters had been destroyed by concentrated bursts of .50 caliber fire. The surviving Zeros, their formation shattered and their attack broken, scattered in all directions. No American aircraft was lost. No American pilot was even hit by Japanese fire. The revolution was complete, but its full implications were only beginning to emerge. What Japanese pilots didn't yet understand was that this tactical transformation represented something far more dangerous than new combat techniques. It demonstrated American industry's ability to produce fighters designed around specific tactical requirements. Aircraft built not just to fight, but to win through systematic technological superiority. The question haunting Japanese air commanders wasn't whether they could adapt their tactics to counter American innovations. It was whether their industrial base could produce the aircraft and train the pilots needed to compete with an enemy whose advantages were multiplying exponentially. The radio crackled with urgent Japanese voices as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai watched American fighters tear apart his squadron over the Philippines. 8 Zeros destroyed in less than 2 minutes, their pilots never given the chance to demonstrate the aerial artistry that had once dominated Pacific skies. The systematic destruction of Japanese air power was no longer a series of isolated encounters. It had become an industrial process. January 12, 1944. The humid air above Clark Field reeked of burning aviation fuel and cordite, the acrid smoke of destroyed aircraft mixing with the sweet decay of tropical vegetation. Below, the concrete runways bore the scars of repeated strafing attacks. Black craters filled with coral and metal fragments. Abandoned fuel trucks overturned like discarded toys. The sound of distant explosions rolled across the airfield as American bombers continued their systematic destruction of Japanese aviation infrastructure. Sakai's remaining aircraft limped toward the emergency strip at Nichols Field, its fabric control surfaces shredded by .50 caliber bullets, hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines. His wingman was gone, not shot down in honorable combat, but obliterated by a 2-second burst from a diving Thunderbolt that had appeared from nowhere, fired with devastating precision, then climbed away before any Japanese pilot could respond. This was no longer war. This was extermination. The numbers told a story that Japanese high command refused to acknowledge. In the 6 months since October 1943, American fighters had achieved kill ratios that defied traditional combat mathematics. Where Japanese pilots had once expected to trade losses roughly equally with enemy fighters, they now faced destruction rates of 10-1, 20-1, sometimes complete annihilation without inflicting a single loss on attacking American formations. The Thunderbolt had become the symbol of this transformation, but it was the systematic nature of American tactical evolution that truly terrified Japanese planners. Intelligence reports described entire squadrons of American pilots trained in identical boom and zoom techniques, flying aircraft with standardized armament and performance characteristics executing coordinated attacks with mechanical precision. Industrial warfare had arrived in the Pacific, and Japan was being systematically outproduced, outtrained, and outfought. Captain Ralph Hoot Gibson adjusted his oxygen mask as his P-47 climbed through 18,000 feet, part of a 36 aircraft formation approaching the Japanese stronghold at Truk. The massive lagoon complex had been called the Gibraltar of the Pacific by American intelligence, a fortress bristling with aircraft and defended by some of Japan's most experienced pilots. Within 3 hours, it would be a smoking ruin. Gibson's squadron flew in loose formations that maximized their aircraft's strengths while minimizing exposure to Japanese tactics. No tight defensive circles that could be broken by agile Zeros. No low-altitude approaches that negated the Thunderbolts' high-altitude advantages. Instead, stepped formations at varying altitudes, with energy management and coordinated attacks planned with the precision of a factory assembly line. The Japanese defenders rose to meet them in formations that would have been magnificent 2 years earlier. Zeros climbed in perfect V formations, their pilots executing aerobatic maneuvers that demonstrated years of training and natural flying ability. Wing Commander Jiro Horikoshi watched through binoculars from the control tower, his heart swelling with pride at the graceful aircraft he had designed dancing through the tropical sky. The massacre that followed lasted exactly 7 minutes. American fighters dove on the climbing Zeros from multiple directions, their attacks coordinated by radio communication and executed with devastating efficiency. The Japanese formation, caught climbing through 15,000 feet where their lightweight fighters struggled in the thin air, never had a chance to demonstrate their legendary maneuverability. Gibson's first burst caught a Zero in the engine cowling at 200 yards, the .850 caliber guns delivering 96 rounds in 1.2 seconds. The Japanese fighters' unprotected fuel tanks ignited instantly, turning the graceful aircraft into a falling torch. His wingman simultaneously destroyed a second Zero with a brief, precise burst that tore away the aircraft's entire tail section. The surviving Japanese pilots scattered, their formation destroyed, their attack on American bombers broken before it could begin. Those few who survived would later describe the encounter as fighting not individual pilots, but a machine, a systematic, coordinated killing apparatus that destroyed aircraft with industrial efficiency. Horikoshi watched his beautiful fighters fall like burning leaves, each one carrying years of engineering, refinement, and pilot training. He turned away from the window, unable to witness the destruction of everything he had created. What would you do, watching your life's work, aircraft you had designed, with love and precision, being systematically destroyed by enemies who treated aerial combat as a production problem, to be solved through superior firepower and coordinated tactics? The human cost extended far beyond the immediate destruction of aircraft and pilots. In hidden hangars across the Pacific, Japanese mechanics worked 18-hour shifts, cannibalizing damaged fighters to keep a handful airworthy. Replacement pilots arrived at forward bases with 30 hours of flight training, compared to the 300 hours that had been standard earlier in the war. Fuel shortages, forced training cuts that left new pilots helpless against American fighters flown by veterans with over 1,000 combat hours. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka watched a replacement pilot taxi his Zero into a revetment, the aircraft's engine coughing and missing on low-octane fuel salvaged from damaged barrels. The young pilot, he couldn't have been more than 19, climbed down from his cockpit with shaking hands, his face pale with the knowledge that tomorrow's mission would likely be his last. They told us in training that American fighters are slow and clumsy, the replacement whispered to Tanaka as they secured the aircraft. But the pilots who came back yesterday said the Thunderbolts strike like lightning and disappear like ghosts. Tanaka said nothing. What could he tell this boy? That Japanese fighters were still superior in turning dogfights that no longer happened. That pilot skill mattered when American tactics systematically avoided any situation where individual ability could influence the outcome, that courage and tradition could overcome 8 50-caliber machine guns fired by pilots trained to kill rather than to duel. The war was being lost in ways that Japanese military tradition had never contemplated. Industrial might trumped individual skill. February 22, 1944. The briefing room at Iwo Jima fell silent as intelligence officers presented photographs of the latest American carrier raids. The images showed airfields stripped of aircraft, hangars reduced to twisted metal, and fuel storage areas burned to the ground. More disturbing were the reconnaissance photographs of American carriers, dozens of them with hundreds of aircraft spotted on their decks. Commander Minoru Genda studied the photographs with growing despair. Each American carrier carried more aircraft than many Japanese air bases could support. The industrial capacity that produced such naval aviation forces was beyond Japanese comprehension, much less Japanese ability to counter. "How many Thunderbolts do they have?" asked a young pilot, his voice barely audible in the hushed room. Genda consulted his intelligence summary. "Our estimates suggest over 10,000 in production or deployed to forward bases. They are building approximately 500 per month." The silence that followed was profound. Japanese aircraft production had peaked at 200 fighters per month, and recent bombing raids on homeland factories had reduced that number significantly. The Americans were building more of a single fighter type than Japan could produce of all aircraft combined. The mathematics of industrial warfare were inexorable, and Japan was on the wrong side of the equation. But numbers alone didn't explain the complete transformation of aerial combat. The psychological impact of systematic destruction was breaking the spirit of pilots who had once considered themselves the finest aviators in the world. Where Japanese naval aviation had been built on traditions of individual excellence and aerial artistry, American tactics reduced combat to a series of coordinated attacks executed with mechanical precision. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Thunderbolts described not fighting other pilots, but battling a system radio-coordinated attacks from multiple directions, devastating firepower, applied with surgical precision, and aircraft that could absorb battle damage that would destroy any Japanese fighter. The war in the air was becoming a contest between artisans and industrialists, and the industrialists were winning. As spring approached and American forces prepared for the next phase of their Pacific offensive, Japanese air commanders faced a reality they could barely acknowledge. Their finest pilots were being systematically destroyed by enemies who had turned aerial combat into a production problem, solved through superior technology and coordinated tactics. The question was no longer whether Japan could maintain air superiority in the Pacific. The question was whether Japanese aviation would exist at all when the war finally ended. The last radio transmission from Japanese Fighter Command at Okinawa lasted exactly 14 seconds. American heavy fighters approaching from all directions. Cannot. Then, silence, broken only by the distant thunder of Pratt & Whitney radial engines diving through 20,000 feet of Pacific sky. By June 21, 1945, the transformation was complete. Japanese aviation had been systematically erased from existence. The morning air above Kadena Airfield carried the familiar cocktail of high-octane gasoline, burnt cordite, and the metallic tang of shredded aluminum scattered across coral runways. Steam rose from the twisted wreckage of what had once been the most formidable fighter force in the world, now reduced to blackened fuel stains and fragments of fabric fluttering in the trade winds. The sound landscape had changed too. No more the high-pitched whine of climbing Zeros, only the deep, relentless rumble of American radial engines maintaining their deadly patrol patterns. Major William Dunham eased his P-47N through a lazy turn at 15,000 feet, part of a combat air patrol that no longer expected to encounter enemy fighters. The long-range Thunderbolt variant beneath him represented the final evolution of American fighter design, extended fuel capacity, refined aerodynamics, and the same devastating 8-gun armament that had torn apart Japanese formations for 2 years. More importantly, it embodied industrial capacity that Japan could never hope to match. 15,600 P-47s had rolled off American production lines by war's end. Japan's entire fighter production for 1945 totaled fewer than 3,000 aircraft of all types. The mathematics of industrial warfare had reached their logical conclusion. Below Dunham's aircraft, the remnants of Japanese aviation lay scattered across Okinawa's limestone landscape. Burned-out revetments held the skeletal remains of Zeros that had been caught on the ground during the relentless American strafing attacks of April and May. Maintenance hangars stood empty, their concrete floors stained with oil and hydraulic fluid from aircraft that would never fly again. The few Japanese pilots who had survived the systematic destruction of their squadrons had been evacuated to the home islands, leaving behind only the physical artifacts of what had once been the world's most feared naval aviation force. The human cost extended far beyond mere statistics. In hidden bunkers and abandoned command posts, Japanese aviation officers compiled their final reports with shaking hands. The documents, later discovered by American intelligence teams, revealed the complete psychological collapse of an air force that had once dominated half the Pacific Ocean. The enemy's heavy fighters attack in coordinated formations of 30 to 40 aircraft, wrote Commander Yasuna Kozono in his final operational report. Our pilots have no opportunity to demonstrate their training or skill. They are destroyed before they can engage in combat. The war in the air has become a systematic slaughter. Kozono's words captured the fundamental transformation that the P-47 had catalyzed. Traditional aerial combat, the individual duels between skilled pilots that had characterized early war encounters, had been replaced by coordinated attacks executed with industrial precision. American fighter squadrons operated like aerial assembly lines, destroying enemy aircraft with the same methodical efficiency that characterized tank and aircraft production in Detroit and Seattle. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating and complete. Where they had once approached combat with confidence in their superior training and aircraft agility, they now flew knowing that each mission would likely be their last. American fighters appeared in overwhelming numbers, struck with coordinated precision, and disappeared before any response was possible. Flight Petty Officer Kaneyoshi Muto wrote in his final diary entry, discovered weeks later in the wreckage of his quarters, "The Americans no longer fight us. They execute us. Their heavy fighters appear from all directions at once, their guns firing streams of fire that tear our aircraft apart like paper. We cannot turn fast enough, cannot climb high enough, cannot escape their systematic destruction. What would you do? Knowing that your next takeoff would almost certainly be your last, that your aircraft's legendary agility meant nothing against enemies who refused to engage in the type of combat you had trained your entire life to fight?" The spring offensive at Okinawa demonstrated the complete evolution of American fighter tactics. P-47 squadrons operated in coordinated formations that covered entire sectors of airspace, their pilots communicating by radio to coordinate attacks and prevent any Japanese aircraft from reaching Allied shipping or ground forces. The systematic nature of these operations eliminated individual heroics in favor of collective efficiency. On April 7, 1945, the largest remaining Japanese air offensive of the war, Operation Kikusui, launched over 300 aircraft toward the American fleet at Okinawa. Within 4 hours, over 200 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, most by coordinated attacks from Thunderbolt and Corsair squadrons using proven boom and zoom tactics. Not a single American ship was sunk by Japanese air attack. The industrial foundation of American victory extended beyond mere aircraft production to encompass every aspect of aviation warfare. American pilots arrived at forward bases with over 1,000 hours of flight training, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical instruction. Japanese replacement pilots in 1945 averaged 30 hours of training total, much of it in aircraft with severely limited fuel supplies. American ground crews maintained aircraft with abundant supplies of spare parts, high-quality fuel, and specialized equipment. Japanese mechanics cannibalized, destroyed aircraft to keep a handful airworthy, often using automotive gasoline in aircraft engines designed for high-octane aviation fuel. American intelligence provided detailed information about Japanese aircraft capabilities, tactics, and deployment patterns. Japanese intelligence had largely ceased to exist as an effective organization. The contrast was absolute, and the outcome inevitable. Technical Sergeant Harold Walsh watched the last operational Japanese fighter, a Lone Zero, attempting to reach Kadena Airfield, disintegrate under the concentrated fire of 4 diving Thunderbolts. The engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. The Japanese pilot never had time to execute a single defensive maneuver before his aircraft was torn apart by .50 caliber bullets. Walsh had been maintaining P-47s since their first deployment to the Pacific Theater. He had watched American tactics evolve, from individual dogfighting to coordinated squadron attacks, to the systematic air superiority operations that now characterize the final phase of the war. The Thunderbolt had been both catalyst and symbol of this transformation. The Jug changed everything, he later told military historians. Not because it was the best fighter, the Mustang was probably better in some ways, but because it proved that you could win air wars through superior firepower and tactics rather than individual pilot skill. It was the first truly industrial fighter aircraft. Industrial warfare had triumphed completely. August 6, 1945. The atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima fell through skies that no Japanese fighter rose to defend. The systematic destruction of Japanese aviation was so complete that even the most important targets in the home islands lay defenseless against Allied attack. 6 days later, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the document made specific reference to the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, but made no mention of Japanese air power. There was no air power left to mention. The P-47 Thunderbolt had helped write the final chapter of Japanese aviation in language that could not be misunderstood. Overwhelming firepower, coordinated tactics, and industrial capacity had systematically destroyed the most experienced fighter force in the world. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and absolute. The age of individual aerial combat had ended, replaced by systematic air warfare conducted with industrial efficiency. The graceful Zero, symbol of Japanese technical achievement and pilot skill, had been eclipsed by heavy fighters that treated air combat as an engineering problem to be solved through superior technology and coordinated application of force. In hangars across America, ground crews were already preparing the next generation of jet fighters that would dominate the skies of the Cold War. But they would always remember the Thunderbolt as the aircraft that had proven a fundamental truth. In modern warfare, industrial might properly applied could overcome any advantage in individual skill or tactical finesse. The Thunder had rolled across the Pacific, and when it finally fell silent, the world had changed forever.